Covenant podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective.
We pray you find this resource edifying, faithful to Scripture, and Christ exalting. Now, let's get started. In today's episode, my co-host Jimmy Johnson and I speak with Dr. James Renihan on his forthcoming book, For the Vindication of the Truth. This book is planned to be released on January 31st by Founders Press. We encourage you to go to their website and order this book. But until then, we hope this conversation on the First London Confession of Faith will be profitable to you. Now, let's get started.
Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. Jimmy Johnson here with my co-host, Austin McCormick, and we have the privilege for the third time to have Dr. James Renihan on the podcast with us. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Renihan.
Thank you, brothers. It's good to see you again and be with you.
So you have written a commentary on the First London Baptist Confession of Faith. And with that being said, why is it helpful to understand the historical context and the theological content of this document in particular?
Yeah, as I understand it, it's scheduled to be released on the 31st of this month. I think it's Crawford Gribeen who has said that the First London Confession of Faith is one of the most important documents in Baptist history. And you see it talked about in a variety of places, but so far as I know, no one has ever before made an attempt to look at it, to expound it. And so I took that task up trying to do it. Now, you asked, what about the historical and theological context of the document? Well, see, that's exactly what I've tried to do, is to write an exposition in those terms. I have taught Baptist symbolics ever since 1998, many times, both when I was in Escondido at IRBS, here in Texas, but also overseas in a couple of different places, and in a variety of churches around the United States. And way back when I began to teach on the Second London Confession, I realized that it was important to begin at the beginning, which is basically the First London. Now, it's my view that that confessions of faith, being historical documents, deserve to be understood in their own context and history. That is, it's very easy to read an old document and read it in the light of what's common in our day and age and to interpret it that way. But I became convinced, in fact, while I was doing my PhD work, it came to me that some of the modern ways that we view old documents fail really to understand what was intended by their original publication. Now, you can't get in. I'm not talking about authorial intent, because you can't get into the minds of any authors. But what I'm talking about is how would any of these documents have been understood by the people who published them, by the churches who were the people in the churches who signed off on them, or even by the broader Christian community? How were they viewed? And that's where we need to go first and foremost in our understanding of confessions. And so I decided that what I needed to do with the First London was try to put it into its context, both in terms of history, because even, for example, the articles towards the end of the confession that deal with political circumstances change. There's the first edition of the confession was in 1644, then it was revised in 1646, and it was revised again in 1651. And the political commentary or exposition or doctrine that is confessed in each of those is different, because each one of them comes at a different political circumstance in the history of England, and especially London, because it was published in London. So to think in terms of the historical and then the contextual, what I mean by that is what was the currency of theology in the day? How did they understand words, phrases? Let's say that you were a member of one of those 7 churches, and the Confession of Faith was put before you to read. How would you have understood its language? Maybe not exactly in the same way that someone today would understand it. And so it seemed to me really important to go back and to ask the question, how would it have been understood by the subscribers and also by the Christians around them? And one of the things that I did was, I discovered quite a few, books, mentions in books by opponents, criticisms that were made, some of them quite lengthy, books that were written directly against the Confession of Faith, others in passing in this or that work. And so I wanted to ask the question, how do these people who are critics and opponents view this document? What are they saying about it? And how does it evidence response to these critics? So that's the contextual situation. What was going on in the 1640s that influenced this, both in terms of the culture in which they lived, that's the historical part, and the theology that was accepted in the day. How does the confession fit? And I'm doing the same thing. I'm working on my exposition of the Second London Confession, which, in fact, this morning I was working on chapter 30 of the Lord's Supper. And I want to do the same thing there. How would a member of one of the churches in 1677 understood the doctrine? That's the question I'm trying to answer.
Thank you for that. Before we move on to the next question, I just had a follow-up in the initial answer you gave us. You mentioned a class that you have taught since 1998, Baptist Symbolics. For the sake of our audience, can you just tell us what symbolics is?
Yeah, symbols is an ancient term that refers to creeds and confessions of the church. They symbolize the faith.
Thank you. Very helpful. And so as we continue to talk about one of the confessions of faith, the First London Confession, what are the historical origins? What significance did men like Kiffin, Knollys, and Spilsbury play in the formulation of this document?
Yeah. Matthew Bingham has published a really excellent book called Orthodox Radicals. And he's also published a couple of articles in academic journals. And I think that he has convincingly shown that the appearance of the First London Confession at the end of 1644 was in response to a demand that was made by the Westminster Assembly. The Westminster Assembly was not particularly friendly to groups that deviated from their perceived theology. Now, in 1644, they hadn't yet come to the point where, well, no, let me put it this way. In 1644, you had Episcopalians, you had Presbyterians, you had Congregationalists, you had a variety of views within the Westminster Assembly, but they all practiced infant baptism. And they weren't particularly amenable to the Baptists. Matt shows that they weren't called Baptists back then, but that's beside the point. Anyways, the Westminster Assembly, apparently fearing that they might have been politically treasonous people who would undermine the strata of society, demanded that they give an open and plain declaration of their views. And so in 1644, it was about a month, maybe 5 or 6 weeks after that request came, more than a request, a strong demand from the Westminster Assembly, the confession appears. Soon afterwards, it was critiqued in print by some important men, including a couple who were members of the Westminster Assembly, most notably in the first case, Daniel Featley. And so in response to Featley, but also a Presbyterian in London named Thomas Bakewell, they revised the confession. And so you had in 1646, I think it was about 14 months after the first edition, the second revised edition came out to clarify some of the things that had been said and to respond within the confession itself, within its paragraphs or articles, to some of the critiques that had made. And then 5 years later, in 1651, a minor revision came out the third time, probably mostly for some further clarification, but also because the political circumstances had changed and they wanted to update what they said to meet what was happening. In 1644, Parliament and the king are at war. By 1646, it's pretty obvious that Parliament will win. In 1651, the king has been put on trial, executed in January 1649, and now England is trying to find a new political system under which it can operate. And so the various statements about the civil magistrate at the end of the confession reflect those three different circumstances. Now, you asked about William Kiffin, Hansard Knowles, and John Spilsbury. The confession itself doesn't give us the names of the authors or editors, because it is really an edited document in many ways. But some of the opponents seem to indicate that Spilsbury was a major contributor, if not the primary editor of the document. Kiffin probably was involved. Hansard Knowles didn't join the movement until 1645, so he wasn't part of the first edition. And one wonders how much he had to do actually with the 1646. He signed it, but I don't know that there's any evidence that he participated in the revision as it came out. So Spilsbury for sure, Kiffin almost certainly, Knowles as a signer in 1646.
As you have said multiple different times that there were a few different editions of the confession, and you kind of already answered to the fact of whether or not there were any significant differences, and it sounds like you would say no, most of them were political and adjusted to the times in which they were written. So moving from that discussion, what would you say the relationship is between the first and second London Confessions? And are there any significant theological changes that take place between the two?
Well, do you mind if I go back to the other question? Because actually,
of course,
it's more complicated than what I've already said. The two who made the longest critiques were Robert Bailey, who was a Scots commissioner to the Westminster Assembly, and Thomas Bakewell, who was a Presbyterian layman in London. But Bailey was an astute theologian, and he made some observations on the 1646 edition that in my exposition I acknowledge are sometimes actually difficult to resolve. Let me use that word. He claims that much of the strength of the Calvinism, meaning predestination and what we would know as the 5 points of Calvinism, that much of that was watered down or maybe expressed in such a way that perhaps Arminians could subscribe to the 1646 edition, which is a really interesting observation. And I think that I don't agree with his conclusion, because he was a critic who was trying to find all the bad things. But nevertheless, the fact that they shaved off some of the strength of their articulation of the 5 points in the 1644 edition is noteworthy. Likewise, and this is a really serious problem that Bailey addresses. In 1646, to use his language, they scraped out some important statements about the doctrine of God and the personal relations of the persons of the Trinity. And they made they committed a real faux pas, in my opinion. In the 1646 edition, there's preface to it a letter. And the letter suggests that if anyone has any further questions about the doctrine of the churches, they could look at a book written by a man named Samuel Richardson, who was one of the subscribers. And Bailey accurately reflects the fact that they make this statement. But when you go and read Richardson's book, he's quite unorthodox on the doctrine of the Trinity. And he almost seems to be a tritheist. He wants to deny the eternal generation of the Son and the eternal procession of the Spirit. And Bailey recognizes this fact, and he says, I can't believe that the members of the churches that subscribe to this confession would actually hold such a heterodox or even heretical view. And I think he's right. In my exposition, I say this is a difficulty that has to be overcome. And the only way that it can be overcome, to bleed over into the question you just asked me, is to put it in the light of the Second London Confession. So, did the First London, were there changes between them beyond politics? Well, that's a possibility. And you'll have to read the book to think through some of those things. Were they, there were 7 churches in London surrounded by what seems to have been, at least in the language of, it's either Bailey or Featley, thousands who didn't, of what we would call Baptists, who didn't subscribe to their confession. They're in the midst of these people. Did they shave off some of the rough edges of their Calvinism? Well, that's an interesting question. Now, if I can move forward to what you just asked me, because they tie together. One of the main themes of the book is that the First London Confession, in its various iterations, is really a good confession. There's nothing wrong with it, but it has deficiencies, and some of these deficiencies I've just given to you. And left to itself, it's possible that it could be charged with unorthodoxy or heterodoxy. Its worst enemies might want to say heresy. I think that's an overblown rhetorical statement that doesn't deserve to be applied. One of the themes of the book, though, is that the authors, the editors of the Second London Confession assert in their letter to the judicious and impartial reader that the theology of the two confessions is the same. And so I argue that First London is incomplete and imperfect without Second London, and that Second London clarifies whatever deficiencies might be present in First London. And I try to show that by, for example, on the doctrine of God. If you read chapter 2 of Second London, you'll see that they incorporate a good bit of language that comes right out of the 1646 edition of the First London Confession. And they do so in the context of that much better explicit doctrine of God that's contained in Second London than First. And so they weren't afraid to take language from First London, incorporate it into Second London in a longer statement that is thoroughly orthodox. So, you see that many times throughout Second London. It takes up language from First London as a means to supplement or express the doctrines that it's confessing. So yeah, it is important to see them in relationship to each other. Second London, you had several men who signed both confessions. You had the same churches issuing both, although there were many more who signed on to the Second London in 1677. A period of 30 years is not that long between the two confessions. And so even in the 17th century, if somebody was 30 years old when the First London was published, they'd only be 60 when the Second London was published. And that's a reasonable lifespan for a lot of people. I mean, Hansard Knowles and William Kiffin both lived into their 90s. So you had people in the churches who were alive and well. Likewise, you had a trail of writing. You had a lot of books that had been published, so people could examine the claims. Is the theology of the two confessions the same? And every bit of information says yes, they were.
That is helpful clarification in the relationship between the first editions of the First London, and thank you for speaking to the theological similarities between the first and second. But perhaps it might be helpful for you to take just a moment to briefly describe to our audience what New Covenant theology is as I ask you this next question. What do you make of those who confess New Covenant theology who are unwilling to confess the Second London, but are willing to confess the first?
Yeah, okay. Maybe it would be better to speak of New Covenant theologies, plural, because, and to be honest, I haven't read up on the development of things for a couple of years, and I don't know where some of the men are, and I wouldn't want to misrepresent them. But based on what I have known in the past, there are a variety of approaches within the camps. And so New Covenant theology basically says, no, I don't want to try to define it, because if I define it one way, somebody else is going to make a comment on your blog that says, no, that's not what I believe, but I believe in New Covenant theology. So, unless you're able to talk about all the different varieties, I'm not sure that it's the best and wisest thing to try to pin anything on any of them. So we'll let those brothers express themselves as they would like to do so. But that I can still go ahead and answer your question, because you will find a number of men who argue things such as the First London Confession is a true Baptist confession, the Second London Confession is a compromised document. The First London Confession has a different view of the law and covenant theology to the Second London Confession, etc. You have those kinds of statements. Well, let me just address those two questions. The first one is really a misunderstanding of the First London Confession, what it's all about. Because it usually, that objection is usually framed in terms of, well, the Second London Confession was, it reflects the Westminster Confession, and the Baptists adopted it because they wanted to identify with the Presbyterians, and there would be a certain amount of safety in doing so, et cetera. And of course, that fails to recognize the fact that in 1677, all of the dissenters were being persecuted, and to identify with the Westminster Confession or the Savoy is actually to bring more persecution on yourself than not. But also, it fails to recognize the fact that the First London Confession was intentionally published in order to demonstrate their orthodoxy, or the similarity of faith that they had with the members of the Westminster Assembly. At that point, you still have everybody at Westminster involved in the Church of England. Some of them may have been Presbyterian, some of them may have been Anglican or Episcopalian in their views, but still, the Presbyterians wanted to reform the Church of England to be a Presbyterian church. Those who were committed to episcopacy wanted to see it continue to be Episcopalian. You had independents or Congregationalists who were hoping for a Church of England that would be comprehensive enough to include congregational churches. The First London was written in that context to say to those men, we agree with you, we're like you, we're not heretics. Please recognize that fact and give us the freedom to worship according to our consciences. And then, when they revised it in 1646, they even more so followed that pattern, because they, in responding to Daniel Featley and Robert Bailey and Thomas Bakewell and Thomas Edwards and the other critics, they continued to shave off the rough edges and to express themselves in ways that would be acceptable to the Pedo-Baptists around them. And I say in the book, and I don't say this as a criticism, but I say the First London Confession is more of a compromised document than the Second London Confession. But that was their purpose. You see, that's why they published it, because they wanted to identify with those churches. And so to make that criticism really misunderstands and misrepresents the historical circumstances of the day. The second one, to say that the Second London Confession has a different view of the moral law, the covenants, it is also a very serious misunderstanding. First London was based primarily on a couple of sources. It was based, about 50% of it comes from a document from 1596 called the True Confession, which was written by separatists in the Netherlands. Then it was William Ames's The Marrow of Sacred Divinity is the second most important source. And there are a couple of other minor sources along the way. But when you look at a document like the 1596 True Confession, it doesn't address matters of the moral law and covenant theology in the way that the later confessions do. All that the First London Confession is doing is following the pattern that has been set out by the earlier confessions. And it was published prior to the publication of both the Shorter Catechism and the Westminster Confession of Faith. So they didn't even have that to look to as a source. They used the best available documents. And so when you come to an old document and you say, look, this isn't there, therefore they didn't believe this, is totally bogus. You can't say that. There are other good reasons why a confession of faith may address or may not address than to say, well, because it isn't there, they didn't believe in that. It just does not follow. And so that's a really simplistic approach to the First London Confession, and it simply cannot stand up to critical analysis.
So, Dr. Renihan, you've already completed, and it's about to come out, the commentary on the First London Confession. As you said earlier, you are working on your commentary of the Second London. In writing both of these, in what ways do you desire your books to benefit its readers, or their readers, rather?
Well, first and foremost, I hope to be able to put these two confessions of faith into their historical, cultural, and contextual circumstances so people can read them and understand them, not read into them modern views, whatever those views may be. There are a wide variety of things that can be read back into these confessions. And so I would hope that readers will be able to look at this and say, that's what it was intended to mean. I just to repeat in different words something that I said earlier, my desire would be for a member of one of those churches to be able to read my exposition and say, yes, that's what we meant. I don't intend, that modern readers must necessarily agree with what they intended by their language. But if modern readers don't agree with what they said, I think honesty requires them to say, this is what they meant, but I don't agree with that. Therefore, I don't agree with this part of the confession. I take it another way. Let me just give you a real easy take on that. In Second London 26:4, the Pope is Antichrist. Virtually every church that I've encountered, PCA, Reformed Baptist, OPC, they all take an exception to that. Why? That's my question. Why? I don't personally. I don't take an exception to it, and the reason is that I think it's misunderstood by a lot of people. It's in a paragraph and in a chapter on ecclesiology, not eschatology. People stumble over the fact that 2 Thessalonians 2 is the proof text. But if you take the first half of that paragraph, which speaks about Christ and his rule in the church and the rightful place that he has, compare it to the second half of the paragraph, which speaks about the Pope and what the Pope claims for himself, it's very clear that the Pope is Antichrist by the claims that he makes. And so, if somebody wants to object to that statement in Second London, okay, you're free to do that. But do so recognizing that your reason for objecting to it needs to be understood in light of the ecclesiological focus of that paragraph. And I do think that if somebody reads my exposition of 26:4 in Second London, hopefully they'll say, oh, wait a minute, it's not about eschatology, it's about ecclesiology. I guess it's right.
Thank you for that example, and we hope that these two books that you have written will profit your readers in the way that you desire. To conclude our conversation, what final encouragements do you have pertaining to the First London Confession, either editions or the Second London Confession of Faith, or your upcoming book, or anything else you want to encourage our audience with pertaining to 1689 Baptist theology?
Yeah, thanks. What I would say is that we need to recognize that they are good confessions. In fact, what we've done here at IRBS is, as a matter of principle, we've adopted the First London, the Second London, and we've added to it the Baptist Catechism from 1693. And I like to call those the Baptist three forms of unity. So those together, all three of them, are our theological documents. So the guideposts that we, or the guardrails is a better word to put it, that we seek to focus our attention on. And I would suggest that's a really good way to move forward, is to recognize the commonalities between the three documents, accept all three. I'm not saying that any church has to do so, but recognize that all of those documents belong to us as part of our history, and they can shed a great deal of positive light on us. So I hope if people will get this first volume that will be out soon, God willing, they'll be encouraged by what they read. And then hopefully in about a year, the second volume will come out, and I hope that will be an encouragement as well.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. James Renihan, president of IRBS Theological Seminary, about his forthcoming book, For the Vindication of the Truth. We are going to get you information of where you can go to buy this book. In this conversation, we've talked about the historical origins of the First London Confession of Faith, the significance that men like William Kiffin, Hansard Knollys, and John Spilsbury played in its formulations. We've talked about the differences between the 1644 and 1646 editions of the First London Confession of Faith. We've talked about the relationship between the First and Second London. We've even talked about some ways that people have tried to pit the First London and the Second London Confession up against one another. And so we hope this conversation will be profitable to you. Dr. Renihan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us to discuss your forthcoming book.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, we want to wish you grace and peace.
For additional content, check out our blog ministry at covenantconfessions.com. Also, keep up with our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Lastly, thank you for listening to the Covenant Podcast. Grace and peace to you.